You're very welcome at the 8th annual conference, Belarusian Studies in the 21st Century. So I'm extremely happy to chair this section, and it's extremely nice to open today's conference. The very first panel will be history panel. So we have 4 presenters. Dr. Alena Marková, so it's me, Dr. Oleg Maliugin, Dr. Tatsiana Astrouskaya, and Dr. Iryna Ramanava. Today we have 2 virtual referates and essays and 2 like a live presentation. And so at the very beginning, so I will say like some general words, and then we will listen each presentation. But before each presentation, I will say something about presenter. So a very short CV and like interest and so on and so on. And so I will collect all questions, and after 4 presentations, we have a space for discussion, I guess like 15 minutes. And so this is the workflow for the first history panel. So, and should I start?
The presentation. Okay. Sorry. Sorry.
Yeah, today we are going to talk about Vilnius, and so I decided to choose a slightly provocative term and title of my contribution, Who's Vilnius? But we are going to talk about historical and legal reasoning behind territorial claims and the Soviet legacy. So could you make the next slide? So, on March 22, 1919, the Supreme Soviet of the BSSR, BSSR means like the Russian Soviet Socialist Republic, get an official request by the Supreme Soviet of the Lithuanian Soviet Socialist Republic concerning prospective Belarusian claims to the part of the Lithuanian land. I'm talking about Vilnius and region. Vilnius and Vilnius region that have been gained by Lithuania early in October 1939 from the Soviet authorities. And Vytautas Landsbergis, so you can see him in the picture, the chairman of the former Lithuanian Supreme Soviet, asked the highest representative of the Belarusian authorities, I'm talking about the chairman of the Supreme Soviet of BSSR, Nikolay Nikolsky, to refute their potential territorial claims to Vilnius as unsubstantiated. The next one. What was the, let's say, initial trigger or initial problem? The next one. The situation was triggered by an official speech pronounced earlier by the first secretary of Grodno Regional Committee of the Communist Party, People's Deputy Vladimir Semyonov, on official TV. And according to Semyonov's speech, Belarus will definitely claim all Belarusian ethnic land that have been given to Lithuania earlier. And the second trigger was like a kind of situation described by Landsbergis, and it was a fact of agitation at Belarusian and Lithuanian border. And according to Landsbergis, so you can see this is like from like official record from the National Archive in Belarus. Unknown persons pressed on local Lithuanian inhabitants by saying that these Lithuanian territories would be given to Belarus very, very soon. And Landsbergis appealed to rules of international law, the United Nations Charter, and other international statements to protect current unity of Lithuania as a state. And this Landsbergis appeal was integrated into the official agenda of parliament debates and parliament meetings, Belarusian parliamentary session on March 25, 1990. However, during this session and parliamentary debates, the opposite happens. What do I mean? So the next slide, please.
Next slide.
Next slide. During this session, Dementiy said that they have prepared two official drafts of two official answers. And there were two versions of an official answer to Lithuanian government. And one draft contained the very statement. So in case of secession of Lithuania from the United Union, Belarusian Soviet Socialist Republic no longer recognize act on transfer of part of the Belarusian land to Lithuania, and Belarus leaves the right to claim return of this land to Belarus. And it was like a draft of official answer to Lithuanian part. Well, in fact, this situation opened the prospective platform for future demands on Vilnius region from the Belarusian side. And according to Dementiy, the chair of the Supreme Soviet, Lithuanian Soviet Socialist Republic is still socialistic. And the current Lithuanian authorities, and this is like a citation, don't present the massive opinion of Lithuanian nation because Lithuania was occupied by a central group of politicians, and this group tortures Lithuania. And this is like a citation from Dementiy answer. And therefore, Belarusian parliament will implement this claim to return Vilna in case the whole Lithuanian population will vote for secession from the Soviet Union. And therefore, it was decided to discuss this matter, this issue, and some very famous, very bright legal experts were invited to support this potential claim and to deliver and discuss argument to support potential reopening the Belarusian-Lithuanian issue. And it was the very well-known professor of law of the Belarusian State University, Professor Joseph Yuho, and also the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Anatoly Burinovich was invited too. And and therefore, the main goal of today's contribution of today's presentation is to discuss and to analyze, probably to classify historical and legal reasoning behind the potential but unfulfilled claims for Vilnius region from Belarusian ruling elites and leading politicians in 1919. So can you open the next slide, please? And the first part of this legal reasoning, well, this is like a historical reasoning. So I have decided to make 3 subgroups of the first group. So I'm talking about legacy of Grand Duchy of Lithuania. So it means there was like a very long explanation about like ethnical minorities and majorities, because actually, according to the Joseph Yuho, Litva was an ethnic Belarusian territories, while Jmud minority was an ethnic Lithuanian land, and therefore it was like a good platform again for today's claim. The second point, Pahonia, it means literally in case of parliamentary debates, these experts say, so Lithuanians took our Pahonia, so because this is not their Pahonia, because they have like a beer, like initially. So And as I say, I'm just analyzing these debates and this reasoning. So of course, this is from a historical point of view, this is like a kind of different, but still, this is like at the level of this reasoning. And we are talking about the Navahrudek Pahonia and Polotsk Pahonia, and this is like a kind of like a great historical roots. And the second point, the next point, Vilna is a center of Belarusian national awareness. We are talking about activities of František Skarina, Nasha Niva, medieval period, 19th century, and so on. The next one. And the next slide represents the second group of historical and legal reasoning. And this point go to ethnic issues, because according to this expert, according to these arguments, Lithuanian population is a minority population in case of Vilna. So you can see this is like 4 or 3, even 3%. The vast majority of Vilna is Polonized, it means Catholic ethnic Belarusian population, because they are Belarusians actually, and Orthodox Christian Belarusians because of Russification. But finally, this is, let's say, our people. So what does it mean? This is, we're talking about Belarusian population, majority ethnic Belarusian population. And of course, there was a huge Jewish minority. But all this argumentation goes to the point that ethnic Lithuanian group is a very minor group in case of Vilna and Vilna region. And there are also toponymical reasoning, because actually the city became known as Vilnius only since 1945. The next one. And the next group of reasoning goes to legal reasoning, because there's historical and legal part, two major parts. The legal reasoning, what does it mean? So actually, this Juho speech covered background. So he explained some point, and I'm talking about Soviet-Lithuanian Treaty of July 1920. Vilnius region and other cities were given to Lithuania. And finally, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Vilnius was given to Lithuania on October 10th, 1939. And therefore, there is like a logic of this legal reasoning. In case Lithuanian authorities do not recognize the pact, and they want to exit, let's say, the Soviet Union. So, and they do not recognize the secret protocols related to the pact. Now, this is a very legal and this is very good precondition to deny the past transfer of the Vilnius region to Lithuania too. And Lithuania proclaimed reconstruction of a state within the state borders of 1938. So it means the Lithuanian constitution. It means, according to Juho, that there are no Lithuanian claims to keep Vilnius region, because in this very year, they do not have this region. And also, so as for me, it was the next one. It was very interesting that there were supportive measures which were offered by some deputies to parliament, how to support this claim. And you can see, actually, they offered, I'm talking about like a different deputies, like a voices of different deputies. They offered to increase public pressure in the media. And I'm talking about the very beginning of 1990, to elaborate legal and historical reasoning better, for example, to emphasize the role of the USSR and like a secession and so on and so on. And finally, which seems to me interesting, they offered to support activities of some loyal Catholic priests of anti-Polish and anti-Lithuanian orientation to support their anti-Polish and anti-Lithuanian agitation campaign at the borders. Yeah, and the next one. And finally, conclusion. Actually, okay, there is no conclusion because these claims were not fulfilled finally. And so we see this is like today it seems very provocative, who's Vilnius, because Vilnius is Lithuanian, Vilnius, yeah. But still, actually, the very fact of the emergence and elaboration seems to me very interesting, because we're talking about the very highest state level. We are talking about parliament. We are talking about the chair of the Supreme Soviet, and like a different expert, even legal reasoning. And so therefore, I do think that the very beginning of 90s, Belarusian national emancipation and political development of the post-Soviet period is very interesting because of some unexpected fact, like, for example, debating on Vilnius. So thank you very much. So as I said, so now please keep your questions, and we will come back to the questions at the very end of the section. And today, the second, I'm just sorry, I have to switch. The second presenter is Dr. Iryna Ramanava, professor at the European Humanities Universities. Currently, Dr. Ramanava is a visiting professor at Justus Liebig University in Gießen, and her research interests cover interwar period and the usual relationship between authorities and society. And her latest book, monograph, which is Branding of the Red Dragon, BSSR in 1937-1939, published in Russian in Russia in 2021, won award of the Congress of Belarusian Studies for the best historical monograph. So today, Dr. Ramanava will deliver a presentation, Power and Peasants in the BSSR in 1936-1939, from the Search for Compromises to Mass Repression. So you're very welcome. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Alena. Good morning, dear colleagues.
We cannot hear you.
Hope you hear me well.
Just a
Something
moment.
wrong?
Try to see what's going on with the
Yeah,
sound.
sure.
Have you go there?
Okay, 1 second.
It's on mute. So. Would you mind speaking for a second?
Do you hear me? No?
Очень тихо.
Try again.
Do you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, it's okay now.
Perfect.
Is everyone on mute? Oh, no. This is not. Try to say something, please.
Do you hear me? May I start? Yeah. Good morning, dear colleagues again. I am very happy to be here, but unfortunately only on Zoom. I am very sorry because I wanted so much to be with you in London, but I will make my presentation only with Zoom because I have some problems with my residential permit in Germany. And but I hope next time I will be in London with you. And I'd like, as Alena said before, I'd like to present some topics from my last book about power and peasants in BSSR in this period of time, in the end of 1930s. And as we know, the most massive repressive action of NKVD were being held in August 1937 till November 38. So-called NKVD operation under order number 447 and also national operations. One of the categories of those punished by order number 447 was so-called kulaks and clergymen, importation, and sectarians. So, in fact, primarily peasants and primarily Orthodox. According to available documents, during the mass operation of NKVD in this time, near 55,000 people were arrested in the territory of BSSR. More than 27,000 of them were shot. At the same time, short trials of the leaders of districts, village council, collective farms, the so-called agricultural trials, were going on through the Soviet Union. The populist scenario of this political theater in agriculture was as follows. Local leaders, the secretary of the district party committee, chief agronomist, district zootechnician, MTS director, head of the financial department, and their henchmen, united in family cycles and directed their hostile activities to provoke peasant discontent against the Soviet government. But Stalin learned this and stood up for the peasants and punished those responsible. The fact that the trials did not cease with the beginning of mass NKVD operations, but now they often ended with the firing squads, has raised the question for researchers about their place and significance in the general barrage of repressions of the end of 30s. Nikolay Vers considers these trials as a way to mobilize the peasantry to identify enemies of the people among the leading personnel of the districts, state farms and collective farms. Roberta Manning saw them as both as mobilization strategy and an instrument of the center to punish local leaders who resisted the NKVD operations under number 447. Neither Manning nor Werk were obviously right, as there was no resistance of local chief to the unfolding repressions. Moreover, there are quite a lot of documents about their active participation. In order to understand the logic and place of these trials, it is worth include them in a broader context, not limited to the study of repressions. After studying a large number of documents from the party archives, the KGB archive unfortunately is not available in Belarus, as we know. My main thesis is the top leadership of the USSR by 1937 really harbored illusions about the situation on the ground. Of course, reports on the mood of the population were complied regularly. However, the first mass monitoring of that period of the population's attitude to power was organized before and during the all-Union population census. It was December 1936, January 1937. The census questionnaire included a question about attitudes toward religion. Interest in the enormous questions of faith and belief was superimposed on the interpretation by some believers of Soviet power as power not from God, power of the evil spirits, power of the Antichrist. And the result, the census itself was understood as a stigma. Thus, the census had to be avoided by any means. As we know, in total, about 1 million people in Soviet Union refused to answer, and about 60% of the population called themselves believers, contrary to the expectation of the authorities. The presence of underground religious structures demonstrated the limits of state cultural interventions. They were now seen by the authorities as the centers of the parallel reality. They had their own ideology, their own leaders, their own system of values, etc. And they could not be overcome by poor education and upbringing. According to the new constitution, the right to participate in elections received so-called lishenцы, among them individual farmers or kulaks who had returned from exile, churchmen or believers, etc. The subsequent monitoring of public opinion convinced the authorities that the people might not vote for the nominees of the party and government in the elections under this new constitution. At the same time, Stalin repeatedly stated that it was the elections that would be a test of party cadres, that would allow them to be cleared of ballast. Though in the first half of 1937, the authorities tried to find compromise with the peasants in wider sense, not only with collective farms. Now I'll give more details. We must start from the events in the Lepel districts of the BSSR, since it was here that the first show trial in agriculture in the Soviet Union was held. During the preliminary census in December 1936 in two rural municipalities, Lepel districts, Taisky and Pyshnyansky, approximately 230 people, almost all of whom belonged to individual farmers' families, refused to answer the questions of census officials. This information was included in all union reports and was taken under control personally by Stalin. The Lepel district of BSSR gained all union fame. In January, the Central Committee of Communist Party adopted two special resolutions on this district. A special commission of the Politburo of the Central Committee of Communist Party, Moscow, not Minsk, on Lepel case was created, and so on. Representatives of the center exposed this a counter-revolutionary organization, which by keeping silence under religious cover legalized this outrageous phenomenon and demonstrated and punished disobedience to the authorities. Thus, the authorities translated the conflict into a language which was understandable for them, and the events were laid out in accordance with the algorithm known to them. People were called kulaks, silent terrorist sectarians, anti-Soviet elements. The arrests were made among them. However, quite unexpectedly, given the above, in the beginning of February, next representatives of the Central districts in their reports paid much attention to the harsh material and moral condition of individual farmers due to massive violations of revolutionary legality. As it was said, it was the evil practice of the district party and Soviet organization that was used by the class enemy to organize resistance to the census in the Lepel region. It appeared that the population had boycotted the census mainly because of the local authorities who, instead of reaching out to the people in an effort to explain and educate them, paid more attention to defaults in settling, tax liabilities, or other statutory public levies. Moreover, the authorities carried out their putative duties in violation of revolutionary legality. Thus, until the end of January, those were the anti-Soviet elements among peasants, or here silent terrorists, who were the culprits of the events, and from the beginning of February, local authorities turned into culprits. I think that such a change occurred because it was in February 1937 that Stalin voiced the need to check local cadres and the need to listen to the voice of a small people. Prevention of a repetition of cases similar to the Lepel case was spoken about at all levels, and the leaders of the Soviet Union referred to this case in their speeches and in their articles. Throughout the Soviet Union began the detection of facts similar to those revealed in Lepel, the organization and conduct of show trials under leaders, their arrests. During these trials, bad bosses were punished for violating revolutionary legality. That means that the regime punished for actions that it had not only allowed but expected of its institutions and personnel shortly before. Collectivization and the fulfillment of all norms of product supply were to be ensured by all methods. Condemning local leaders for failure in economic and political campaigns and for the problems of people's daily life was a convenient demagogic device used more than once by Stalin. Stalin, as in the case of the article Vertigo of Success, головокружение от успеха, probably tried to play on people's alleged belief in a good Tsar and act as such. The materials of the party archive for the years 1937-1939 indicate that the authorities were really concerned about the situation in agriculture, which they themselves had created. All plenary session of 1937 and the Congress Communist Party of Belarus necessarily featured questions about the situation in agriculture. Much attention has also been paid to the fact that collective farms are not working satisfactorily and that collectivization had actually halted and none of the levers involved had brought any results. Such disciplinary actions as an exception from collective farms were leading to even dire consequences, and collective farmers themselves were leaving the collective farms in large number. The peasantry was still a significant force to be reckoned with by the authorities. By the way, in the BSSR, there were more than 120,000 peasant farmers, almost a fifth part, as it was noted in the official documents, were not going to the collective farm at all. The authorities were well aware that the peasants and their masses did not support any of their reforms. Now, a number of special measures were taken to attract peasants to collective farms. Some steps were taken to calm the peasantry, including the individual farmers who were soon to take part in the first general elections by secret ballot under the 1936 constitution. It is quite obvious that in the first half 1937, the authorities made an attempt to include individual farmers in their plans and activities. A campaign against the violation of socialist legality against the working peasantry and showed trials of those responsible unfolded across the Soviet Union. During such trials, the peasants were shown what it called the enemy in the face, the specific perpetrators of the current situation in each individual district, collective farm, village. It is important to note that during these events, working peasantry was referred not only as the collective farmers, but also as those who had not joined the collective farmers, the farmers. Until recently, they were classified exclusively as kulaks, real or potential enemies of Soviet power, who had no place in socialist society. In the first half of 1937, the authorities tried to reassert themselves through the appearance of establishing contact with the peasantry. Then, in the second half of that year, they carried out the most massive repressive action by order number 447. The main victim of that were the peasants or so-called kulaks, clergymen, etc. In 1937, the very trials of the bosses offending peasants were found to be sabotage. Subsequent decrees concerning agriculture put everything back to square one. The electoral law was also changed. Thank you so much for your attention. I will be happy to have some questions later, and I will try to answer them. Alena, sorry, we can't hear you at all. Microphone.
There you go.
Есть,
Yeah,
шанс.
should be good.
Okay, now
Yeah,
once
sorry.
again,
Yeah, so
you
yeah,
have to repeat the whole thing.
of course, I guess this is fair to as for Dr. Maliugin because I have to present each participant equally, and very once again, the next presenter is Dr. Oleg Maliugin, visiting professor at the European Humanities University in Vilnius. He holds scholarship for scientists suffering from the war in Ukraine. Dr. Maliugin deals with the history of Christianity on the British Isles from antiquity to the early medieval period. Also, he deals with antiquity studies in Belarus, and also, which is very interesting, he studies history of Belarusian State University, and also he is author of many related publications, study aids and textbooks, and also he is a co-author of many textbooks, study aids, for example, History of Ancient Greece and Rome, published in Russian and Minsk in 2019, and other publications. So today, Dr. Maliugin is going to deliver a presentation, Collaboration and Resistance, academician Nikolay Nikolsky in occupied Minsk, 1941-1943. So you're very welcome.
Thank you very much, Alena. Ladies and gentlemen, the topic of my speech is devoted to the problem of collaboration at war, in particular scientific collaboration with occupation authorities. Earlier, this problem had only scientific, academic meaning, but after the beginning of Russian war against Ukraine, it becomes a practical matter. What the people on occupied Ukrainian territories must do? How should they behave with the occupiers? What about school education? What about medical care? And finally, what about scientific investigations and ties with scientific organization of country occupied? These questions are actual for modern-day Ukrainians who ended up in the occupied territories. It's actual for Belarusians who live under internal occupation of Lukashenko regime now. And to understand the circumstances and the qualities of this situation, we can see the case of the World War II. One of the best examples is Minsk, where many scientists stayed under the Nazi occupation for years. And the fate of the academician Nikolay Nikolsky has a special interest. Next, please. In short, who was the academician Nikolay Nikolsky? He was born in Moscow in 1877. His father, Mikhail Nikolsky, was the first Russian Assyriologist, and Nikolay Mikhailovich also chooses the history of the ancient East as his area of academic interest. After the Russian Revolution, he began to work in newly established Belarusian State University, and he tied his fate with Belarus until his death in 1959. By the start of the war, Nikolay Nikolsky, in my opinion, was the most influential Belarusian historian. He was an academician of the Belarusian Academy of Sciences, the head of the Institute of History, the same academy, and the head of the Ancient History Department of Belarusian State University. But this became possible due to Stalin's repression in the 1930s, when a huge number of Belarusian historians were persecuted. Next, please. The beginning of the war was a genuine shock for all the Soviet citizens, from Stalin to simply workers and peasants. No one could believe that Minsk would fall in the 6th day of the war. As a result, there was no organized evacuation from Minsk. Nikolsky with his family had tried to leave the town on one's own, as many other Minsk citizens. They reached the railway station Kolodyshe, but no more trains to east were departed due to the presence of the German troops near the station. After that, Nikolsky with other refugees had traveled on highway to Mohyliv until the Germans cut off the road. There were no way to east, but only back to Minsk. Next. The academician's family returns to the destroyed Minsk in early July. Fortunately, their house survived and his flat was not looted. It was a rare case in Minsk because more than half of the buildings were demolished and many others were looted or occupied by German soldiers. So began his life under occupation. Okay, next please. And we have official version of his activities dated to Soviet times. The academician refused to cooperate with the German administration and Belarusian nationalists. He quickly, from the winter of 1941-42, established contacts with partisans and actively cooperated with them. In the summer of 1943, when it was very dangerous to stay in occupied Minsk, he was taken to the partisan zone. Next, please. And this wartime works of Nikolsky stay in occupation for 2 years. He wrote 2 monographies on ancient East topics. Firstly, the work on private land ownership in Mesopotamia. It was finished in August of 1941. Secondly, the main work of wartime activities of Nikolsky, monography on Phoenician religious cults according to the text of Ras Shamra, was completed in the summer of 1943. And here on the slide, we can see also a third monography on Belarusian wedding rites. This book was published only in 1956, but he collected the core material for this book during the stay in occupied Minsk. We will talk about this book later. Next, please. But also we have an official version of his activities according to German documents. The files from German archives draw mostly different picture of the events. Indeed, he initially refused to cooperate with the Germans, spring 1942, but already in August of the same year, he signed an agreement on scientific work with Dr. Kraft, head of the Arbeitsgruppe Vice Lieutenant of Einsatzstab Reichsleiter Rosenberg. A question which I have not answered yet. Why did he agree to cooperate with Germans in the summer of 1942 and not earlier? What were the reasons behind his agreement? Next, please. Main question of this presentation is the problem of collaboration with Nazi authorities. In general, the problem of collaboration of locals in occupied Soviet territories with Nazis always was a taboo for historians and other scientists, not only in Soviet times, but in modern-day Belarus. But especially today, the investigation of collaboration movement during the World War II may cause an accusation satisfying the Nazi ideology from the Belarusian authorities. So the truly scientific research of this phenomenon in Belarus is fully impossible now. But without the understanding motives and reasons behind the people who collaborated with Germans, we can draw the true picture of everyday life during the war. And we must remember that people in occupied territories are caught between harm and evil. And for many of them, it was the choice between life or death. As in the case of Nikolsky collaboration with the German occupation authorities, it can be outlined only in a general, as many documents require further study. But in my opinion, main reason for collaboration was the desire to survive in terrible condition of wartime. Next, please. And what was the organization Nikolsky collaborated with? Einsatzstab Reichsleiter Rosenberg, Special Operational Task Force, headed by Alfred Rosenberg, was the agency of National Socialistic German Workers' Party, organized specifically for plunder of cultural assets in German-occupied countries during the Second World War. With the invasion of the Soviet Union in June of 1941 and Rosenberg's appointment as Reich Minister for the occupied Eastern Territories in July, Einsatzstab followed the Wehrmacht to the east. Einsatzstab found no rich private Jewish art collection in the Soviet lands, where all major private property had long since been nationalized. So Einsatzstab turned to the plunder of Soviet state cultural, academic, and other institutions on the Eastern Front. Please next one.
That's one.
Yes. Working groups, Arbeitsgruppe, or main working groups, were organized to head operations in each occupied country for seizure of libraries, archives, and other cultural institutions in search of research materials and for propaganda efforts. The EAA also had separate special staff, Sonderstabe, units to deal with different types of cultural operations, music, prehistory, folklore, among others. Working group Vice Ruthenian or Belarus, with center in Minsk, was created in November of 1941. It was a member of this working group who supervised the scientific work of Nikolsky, including its heads, Dr. Kraft first and Dr. von Krusenstern later. The photos were taken from Bundesarchives collections. Next, please. After the discovery in the folklore archive of Institute of History of Belarusian Academy of Sciences in March of 1942, it was a great interest to these documents from the staff of Sonderstab Volkskunde, special staff of folklore. As a result, there were several research topics for Belarusian scholars concerning the various problems of Belarusian folklore. Nikolsky agreed to investigate some of them, including wedding rites and child games, for instance. And from his interest to wedding rites of Belarusian people, his monography of 1956 he arose. And he had demanded 100 Reichsmarks for each 20 handwritten page of his works. It was an unparalleled example of such salary, because Nikolsky stated to Dr. Kraft that he expected the Germans will pay him not less than Soviets, 1,000 rubles for one printed sheet. Later, other scientists may ask no more than 60 Reichsmarks for 30 pages. So the salary of Nikolsky was very, very high. Please next. It is an intriguing case of context between head of German civil administration Belarus, Wilhelm Kub, and Soviet scientists. As some Belarusian scholars told me, many indications of such context contained in Belarusian Nation Archives documents. However, I did not find any mention of this in the docs of Einsatzstab, and it's still mystery for me. Next, please. However, picture was more complicated, and it concerns not only Nikolsky, but other people who collaborated with Germans. And we can see in documents and memos, Nikolsky not only collaborates with Nazis, but took part in organized resistance to occupants. For example, he helped neighbors to get a job. He had contacts with the partisans, helped them with information. He partially took out the documents of Einsatzstab to partisan detachment. In such circumstances, we can regard him as a good collaborationist. And as a consequence, a second mystery stands in front of me. I didn't find any mention of his cooperation with the Germans, either in memories, Soviet memories, or in the Soviet literature. Another question which I have not answered yet, why there was silence about his collaboration with Nazis after the war. We know about other Soviet citizens and scientists too, who collaborated with Germans. And after the war, they continued to work for Soviet scientific institutions, for example, but not about Nikolsky. My working hypothesis is that this was the result of special efforts of Nikolsky himself and his students and affiliates after the war. And next, please. And the final slide here, evacuation to the partisan detachment. For Nikolsky, this romance with the Nazis ended in 1943. While he cooperated with Germans and discussed further scientific investigations, there were negotiations between partisans and powers in Moscow about his removal into partisan zone. This decision was taken in June of 1943. The preparation of the operation was entrusted to Maria Malakovich, who knew Nikolsky from pre-war times. And finally, Nikolsky with his family left Minsk on August the 1st, 1943. However, the further evacuation from partisan detachment to the Soviet area was unsuccessful. On this reason, Nikolsky spent more than 7 months among the Soviet partisans, and he got the nickname academician partisan. And last, thank you for listening.
So thank you very much. So am I mute?
I think people can hear you. You can ask just in case.
So yeah. So I see. So the next presenter, you can see her here already. Tatsiana Astrouskaya. Dr. Astrouskaya is a research associate at the Herder Institute for Historical Research on East and Central Europe in Germany. She's the author of very famous cultural Descent in Soviet Belarus Intelligentsia, Samizdat, and Non-Conformist Discourses monograph, published in Germany in Wiesbaden in 2019, and then the book was translated into Belarusian language. So research interest, of course, Descent and Samizdat, East European intellectual and Jewish studies, memory politic, and digital history. For example, Dr. Astrouskaya is a member of Marburg Center for Digital Culture and Infrastructure, and so on. Today, she's going to deliver a presentation about Jewish women in Soviet Minsk, gender and nationality through the prism of Jewish immigration from the BSSR. So you're very welcome.
Good morning, dear colleagues. I'm really happy to be here at this great conference already second time. Last time I was in presence, this time online, unfortunately, but still happy to be here. And I think my presentation somehow also organically suits into the topics which were already spoken up by the esteemed colleagues. So the Jewish women, and not only Jewish, as you will see later, I'm going to talk about today, were the wives of the well-known activists for Jewish immigration from Soviet Union, who acted in Soviet Minsk in the 1970s. In general, Jewish and Belarusian history of this period had been written separately. Generally, Jewish immigration falls out of the history of late socialist Belarus, written by Belarusian historians. To the part it is written, the history of Jewish immigration, it was written from the perspective of Jewish studies, and it continues to be presented there as an organic part of a rather homogeneous history of the immigration of Soviet Jews, as it was only one group. My intention here is to contribute this to combine these two perspectives, to look at and to look for a local specificity here, and thus integrate the short but really very bright and intensive period of the history of Jews, so Belarusian Jews, into the history of Belarus. To demonstrate that immigration was very much about the interaction with the space, the landscape of departure, in our case, Minsk, with the local people who stayed. And simultaneously, through this perspective, I hope to be able to critically approach the issues of gender and nationality, and thus integrate this local experience into a broader perspective. So there is not very much known about post-Soviet post-1967 Jewish emigration from Soviet Belarus so far. What we do know, however, mostly revolves around the stories of these, just a moment, of these 6 persons: Anatoly Rubin, Ernst Levin, Svania Gidalya-Kipnis, Naum Alshansky, Yefim Davidovich, and Lev Avshischer. They all gave multiple interviews and left autobiographies where they necessarily talk of their women or wives. Rubin here is an exclusion. He did not talk about his personal relationships, and married upon arrival to Israel. So I will talk about the other 5 families, father on, and here I included also the daughter of Yefim Davidovich because she was one of the important actors. And Lev Avshischer, he had 2 wives during the time his first wife died before he was able to emigrate. So they necessarily talk of their women, sometimes even with pride or gratitude, but completely fail to discuss the women's role in the immigration movement. And even after the decades passed, they attributed all the achievements solely to themselves. However, this wave of immigration from the USSR was a family immigration, and therefore the participation and contribution of every member of the family, including young children, was required and necessary. So it was a collective effort, and still women remain practically invisible behind their much better known husbands. In my database, at the moment, altogether 163 persons actively demanding their right to immigrate in the first half of the 1970s from Soviet Minsk. And 84 of them, a bit more than 1/2, were women. How can we approach the women's experience without being indulged in visual thinking, without just switching perspectives and emphasizing the women's experience instead of that of men? I'm trying to do this by highlighting the variety of identities of these women, of challenges and choices that they faced, and as well as variety of roles and tasks that they conducted. Was Minsk a special case here? Well, yes and no. Of course, it was one of the places of departure for Soviet Jews, one of the cities from which Soviet Jews emigrated. Yet the immigration movement wasn't so intensive here as in Moscow, Riga, or Kiev, and therefore it was often overlooked. Yet it has a very complex history, and it is one of my interests to treat the immigrant stories in a certain relation to this history. Pre-World War II history, when the population of Minsk was to 1/3 Jewish, for example, and of course the history of the Holocaust is here important. Minsk and its suburbs became one of the most horrifying scenes of the Holocaust by ballots. Of course, here Vitebsk, but as illustration, the city of Minsk and its architecture and its materiality, so to speak, was also destroyed in the war. This is, of course, very well known, but somehow when we study the late socialist history of Belarus, we forget this as the centrality of this experience. So in this kind of emptiness, which formed itself after the war, a project of modern Soviet Belarusian society had been constructed. And it was constructed in fundamental opposition to the projects of national revival, be it Jewish or Belarusian, which at this time started to rise from the ashes of war and repression. And this resulted in the struggle for resources, mutual animosity, and anti-Semitism, which surprisingly observed was observed at this time in Minsk, the city which was earlier known for its tolerance. So despite the modernization efforts, ghosts of the war, as Francisco Exler brilliantly put it, but also ghosts of Stalin's repressions, here I refer to Iryna's presentation, destructions and the Holocaust haunted Belarusian society. And perhaps at the periphery, these contradictions were even more palpable. When comparing the biographies of these women, their position and their path to immigration, what can we see? All the mentioned activists were local Belarusian Jews, yet their wives, with only one exception, Asya Levina, who was born and grew up in Luban. The others were like from elsewhere. The others moved to the Soviet Minsk with their husbands from Moscow and Soviet Ukraine. Two of them were Russian women, or Ruskие женщины, as they called them, who nevertheless supported their husbands in their decision and efforts to immigrate. The majority were very well educated and had very promising starts in their career. For example, Nadezhda Ovsischer was a talented singer and was expected to have a brilliant career in Moscow, but married Ovsischer, a military man, and just followed him, leaving everything behind. Klara Alsanskaya graduated from the Moscow State Medical Institute around the middle 1940s, which of course was also not an ordinary thing at the time. Asya Levina graduated from school with a gold medal and similarly successfully studied journalism at the Chisinau State University. How the year of 1971, when the first 10 migrant families left Soviet Minsk, changed their lives? How exactly did they take part in the immigration struggle? If we would like to look closer. The immigration was certainly a family decision. It required that the family held together. It required the consolidation of joint efforts, and not least that of women. Yefim Davidovich, for example, was very ill. He suffered multiple heart attacks, and Maria and Sofia, his daughter, literally nursed him. And because of this, he could continue his struggle, writing multiple letters to different levels of Soviet authorities and international organizations. In the case of Levins, the whole family immigrated, including Asya's sister and her parents, and this of course required an additional effort to take care of the extended family and this limbo situation, to feed, to provide for, to receive multiple visitors. The mental and physical strain was enormous. The case of Esfir Kipnis was somehow different. She hesitated to leave first because she did not want to separate it from her family. From her daughter and granddaughter who wanted to stay in Minsk. And here we can observe how emigration provoked generational conflicts. They occurred in many families. The leaving Soviet Union was perceived as leaving forever, of course. Most of the named men activists were already retired, so their decision to immigrate did not necessarily mean suggested complications at the working place. Yet the wives continued to work and provide for the family, simultaneously also keeping the household. The story of Levin's worth mentioning here. They mutually agreed on splitting obligations, so to speak. Ernst quit his job and fully devoted himself to the business of immigration, as he called it, and Asa should have kept quiet and continued working. Perhaps it was a strategic decision, perhaps because women were generally persecuted less in the Soviet Union, or perhaps he wanted to protect her, but actually she did not keep quiet. She equally signed many of the petitions and she protested against the unfair treatment at her work, as documents show. She also helped others. There was a continuous stream of visitors at their home. So it was really a lot of effort required from her. Klara Alsanskaya continued to work as a medical doctor, and she signed all the petitions together with her husband. And moreover, she was one of the five persons in Minsk who, in protest, refused to vote at the Supreme Soviet elections in June 1974, which was, of course, a scandalous event for the Soviet authorities. The other form of protest was visiting the memorial Yama the site of the killing of Belarusian Jews. The commemoration first took place in 1974 and then was repeated every year. And we have here also women here, as you see, also Russian women. For example, the wife of Davidovich is here commemorating together with men. Women also most certainly suffered persecutions and anti-Semitism, especially at work. When the decision to immigrate became known to the employer, there was a huge pressure. The special case here is of Maria and Sofia Davidovich, who suffered both from authorities and the Jewish community. Davidovich died in 1975 in Minsk. The wife and daughter were allowed to immigrate, yet they returned after 1 year. Probably it was hard to integrate, and they both were approached by the Jewish community, new Jewish only for this, because they were not tough enough, not consequent enough. And the story was, of course, also well used by Soviet propagandists. They had to write repentant letters to Soviets and publish it in Soviet newspapers upon arrival. So I'm coming to my conclusion. I think a couple of points are important here. As it looks from the example of Minsk and the Jewish activisms for immigration, the distribution of roles and fames was rather traditional. Women did not have many opportunities and much freedom to overcome them. This shows also how phantom the idea of Soviet emancipation was, and in this kind of liminal situation, this becomes even more clear. I think it is possible to argue about the diversity of the immigration movement in contrast to its alleged homogeneity. And also perhaps it is possible to question the artificial division between Jewish and non-Jewish perspectives of immigration from the USSR, as I attempted to show they intersect and affect each other. Certainly, the gender perspectives allows for highlighting complex measures that adjoin the departure, and it allows for seeing public and private, state and family relations and something interconnected. And the last thing, these stories might seem not related to Belarusian history anymore, as these people left and the connection kind of was broken off. But in fact, it was not. For example, Asya and Ernst Levin moved to Munich and worked for the Belarusian service of Radio Liberty, Radio Free Europe in the 1980s and communicated intensively with the Belarusian diaspora. I found very interesting documents which shed light on this story in the archives of the Francis Karina Belarusian Library just 2 weeks ago. Thank you very much.
So thank you very much. And I'm open the floor for discussion, because we have 14 minutes for discussion. And so do you have
But we need to use the mic. And we will have one mic in the room and the other one will go.
I had a question for you, Alena.
Yeah, thank you.
The first thing that struck me about 1990 is that Lithuania is trying to secede from the USSR and Moscow is trying to stop it. So how much of this was Moscow orchestrated or part of?
It was because Dementi collaborated with Moscow, and actually my illustration was not an accident with Gorbachev, because it was not an accident because of course there is a time limit, but there was a kind of agenda with Moscow, and every single word, every single phrase has to be accepted by Moscow. And if we can see, for example, National Archives, the records from different meetings, as you can see, for example. And yes, it was a hidden agenda. What if they? So they have to approve, and we have to give them. Yeah. So the answer is yes.
So who is Moscow?
I don't know. So as for records, so there are no names, but for example, Dementi says often in Moscow or Moscow Central Committee or something like this. But we have no names, but as for these records, but I guess like groups of comrades, I don't know. So of course, they have names, but I don't know who it was. But I guess the highest authorities. So because it was like an acute issue, I guess. Yeah. Thank you very much.
And if you could introduce yourself, that would be great.
Okay, I am Vera Haponova, a PhD student at Edinburgh University, archaeology. But my question is again to Alena, since we're on this topic. I have to admit my ignorance. I didn't know that the history of Pagonia goes back to Polotsk before Novogrudok. So can you tell a few words about that?
So sorry. So and what is the question? Because
the question is that in your presentation you briefly mentioned that Pagonia was the symbol of Polotsk before Novogrudok. So
no,
I assume
at the very first stage where it was Principality of Polotsk, or Polotsk Principality, and according to you, a professor of law, and according to this, like a set of argumentation, the very first Pagonia was Polotsk Pagonia. Then it was Novogrudok Pagonia, and then like Lithuanian, they borrowed our Pagonia. So this is the logic of this legal reasoning.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
There's one more question there.
Thank you. Thank you. My name is Rosa Scriptate, and I am a PhD student from Nottingham University. Again, I also have a question for Dr. Markova. So first of all, thank you so much for such an interesting and thought-provoking presentation. And I must confess, despite being Lithuanian national and having lived at 2009, I wasn't aware of this debate. So I was very much aware of the debate regarding the Polish claim to Vilnius, so Vilnius Nasha claim. So so my question is, so how is this debate visible in Belarus, and is there like a general would you be aware of the like general consensus of that, or is there a strong debate as such in terms of that currently in Belarus, and are there any strong opinions prevalent?
Well, thank you very much for your question. This is a very interesting question. Probably I will share this question to my colleagues, like all of my colleagues, because you know, there are many like extreme, like kind of like a fanatic opinions, but like honestly, we don't take them like kind of seriously. Okay, so Vilnius, Nasha, what are you talking about? So of course there are many, you know, just like
not that many. Maybe you don't hear it much.
No. This is a marginal. This is like a kind of marginalized. Yeah, and that is what I would like to share the answer to my colleagues. Yeah, but yeah. So as for me, they are marginal. So yeah, and probably Tatsiana. So probably can you answer?
Yeah, maybe if I can, it's a kind of part question, part comment. Yeah, what struck me in this debate is that this very nationalistic rhetoric was actually produced by the authorities, who are always like very much on the side of the anti-nationalists. Yeah, so they actually struggled against the People's Front, and they struggled against all this, and they watched very closely during the time of perestroika, also up to the early 1990s, not to allow this nationalist rhetoric to be part of public debates, and still they partly probably also so not openly, but a kind of in this private investigation, partly private investigation, they use the same arguments which they actually struggled against.
No, this was part of a wide KGB campaign to undermine Soviet republics' drive for independence, because they would stir up territorial disputes as well as sort of national minorities. Because at the same time that they did sort of trouble in Moldova, they did trouble in Ukraine, they invented yachtbags in Belarus, and they thought if sort of Vilnius to shake it, then Lithuania might slow down its drive for independence. So it's not a kind of one-off thing. It was sort of, wider KGB program how to sort of, slow down the drive for independence. So if you look at it, what's happening at the same time, it's just kind of, small part of a much wider picture, and also the former Soviet republics.
So can you introduce yourself, because this is like a...
Sorry, yeah, I was right. It's Pavel Shestov here. I'm a trustee of the Belarusian Library in London.
Yeah, thank you very much. So so I guess as
hello.
like another remark. So I guess when I started this material, this record, so it seems to me very suspicious. A group of people like agitating. So I guess this is like a kind of artificial. So probably this is like a kind of artificial platform. To make an agitation, and like some people I don't know. So this is
The question online, by the way.
Yeah, another question online. Yeah, so now I see. So Vitaly. Vitaly, so
Yeah, hello.
yeah,
My question is to Oleg Maliugin. It is widely known that even those persons who just lived under occupation had really great problems in their career after the war. And Professor Nikolsky had a pretty successful career in his future. I wonder how he managed to overcome this stigma of being in occupation, of being collaborating, how it was maybe explained by those promoting him, and were there any other examples of academians who stayed under occupation, worked under occupation, collaborate, and then still have successful careers in the Soviet Union after the war? Maybe not in Belarus, but generally, I wonder about these two issues.
Thank you very much for question. What about other academicians? I don't know other examples from, for example, Ukraine or Russian territories, but in Minsk in 1941, there was 3 academicians: Nikolsky, Anufriev, and Gaussman. And only Nikolsky continued the professional career after the war. 2 others were deported to Germany, and later Gaussman died in Austria, and Afanasyev many years lived in the United States of America. Both and Gaussman and Afanasyev after the war were not dismissed the title of academician by the Belarusian Academy of Sciences. And I don't know exact number of scientists in Minsk, but I know about 150 scientists who stay in Minsk from 1941 to 1944, before the liberation of Minsk. Most of them, after the war, continued to work in Soviet institutions or Academy of Sciences, and some of them who also collaborated with Nazis make a scientific career. For example, Nikolay Nikolsky was chosen as an academician too, but after the war. Before, academicians were 3, but stayed only 1.
Thank you.
Well, is there like online questions? Yeah, enough. Yeah, I see.
Tatsiana.
Tatsiana?
And just maybe one more comment, because Oleg, you said that the question of collaboration, the issue of collaboration was like became actual and you know related to contemporaneity only after with the beginning of Russian invasion in Ukraine. But I think it was also after, I mean, after World War II and during the whole Soviet period, and also with, you know, when Lukashenko came to power, this maybe not so sharp, but this is there. And there are so many historians, you know, who collaborated in one way or another, compromised, and you know, in their works. So this is really a very important topic, and it requires comparison, not only with the situation World War II, of course, which was very acute, but also with other cases. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. And so we have like one question more. Yeah. So I saw Tatsiana. Oh, I saw Natalia Chernysheva.
Yeah, thank you very much. My name is Natalia, Queen Mary, University of London. I had actually two questions. I don't know if I can squeeze in two. One was to Oleg. Well, first of all, thank you all four of you for fascinating presentations, amazing research. Really enjoyed listening to this. But I had a question to Oleg, maybe to follow up what you said about the scientists. So how did they manage to get away with it, with that sort of record in the post-war period? Is it because of their, you know, position of authority, or because the Soviet authorities needed them and were willing to look the other way, or how did that pan out? And my second question, if there is time, was to Tatsiana, if I may. From what I understood from your wonderful presentation, the stories perhaps typical of a Soviet woman more broadly, you know, having the responsibilities for essential roles of provision, looking after, you know, caring, as well as kind of supporting in the backstage in terms of how these roles were presented or forgotten, if you like. Did you expect to find something different in terms of the Jewish Soviet experience, in terms of the immigration experience, or did you expect to find this kind of silences about the essential roles that these women carried out? You know, and if you work on archival materials that you know, petitions that may be signed by men, then where do you get the women's voices? Do you speak to them, the descendants? Have they left any traces in terms of their own writing and that sort of thing? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for the question. What about the reasons behind the decision of Soviet powers to stay Nikolsky as academician and a scientist after he collaborated with Germans, and all of powers, all of Soviet party members knows about his collaboration, but no. First reason, I think, as you said, that they needed Nikolsky and his name and his work. But another reason is, I think, it's his stay in partisan detachment. What 2 years in occupation and 7 months in partisan zone, and 7 months were most valued than 2 years in occupation. His nickname is academician, partisan. Only one example of such high scientist in partisan zone. And after the war, after this, the common work, as I think, of Nikolsky and his student and his affiliates to create the legend of partisan academician. Yes. maybe another reason, but I just can't answer now. But maybe one more. After the war, in all Soviet institutions, the discussion took part about the fate of people who stayed on occupied territories. And as now in Belarus, when powers, the authorities tell all who took part in protests must be released from universities or from firms, from institutes and go on. But if we all them dismiss from work, who will be work? And this situation was the same in the after-war years. In the Belarusian State University, more than 40% of staff were under occupation. The main reason of this is a very quick state Minsk under the German occupation. On the 6th day of war, no organized evacuation, no way to escape from town for ordinary people. And for doctor of science, for scientific researchers and so on. And they stayed in Minsk. They lived in Minsk for 3 years, and later they returned to work. And they were very big number. Thank you.
So Tatsiana, I'm just can I ask you very shortly, because the time is over. So Tatsiana.
Yeah, 2 sentences. Thank you very much, Natalia, for the question. Is really brilliant. So yes, I think I started exactly from these contradictions, because in archival documents, you see these women because they signed the petitions. So I found these names. I tried to explain that maybe not so clearly, that there are in all these petitions, women signed them equally. They are on the photographs during these rallies, at Yama. They are also like didn't vote it. I refused to vote in the Soviet elections, which was also scandalous. But when you look at memoirs, interviews, and you have only men, so they are somehow in the archives. And yeah, I was lucky even to take some interviews. So I do have to try to sort out these voices. And of course, there is nothing untypical in. When we look at the Soviet situation in general, also dissident movement was very much men's movement, and at least represented like that. Of course, there are new studies which appear. I try to I didn't have time to mention this, but I think my hypothesis here is that probably this. This kind of situation of immigration was very specific. It was a kind of limbo between, and the other thing, it was a periphery of Soviet Union. Yeah. So in Moscow, we did have some women activists, and here it was different. So these 2 factors served a kind of situation that it was a kind of return to this very traditional family model, even more than in a normal situation, so to speak. So thank you.
Oh, yeah, thank you very much, because we are really out of time. And thank you very much for all panelists and for all your questions. I guess we have like a possibility to make like some networking later.